Just to let you know, Jeremy Corbyn is here. He's just making his way through, so if we can just bear with us for a couple of minutes. Okay, all right. Thank you everyone for being so patient. I guess I don't need to have much of an introduction here today, but I'm really, really proud on behalf of Marxism to say that we have Jeremy Corbyn, who's going to be talking about his experience of the anti-war movement. So, Jeremy?
Sit down or stand? Sit down.
You need to sit because we are zooming.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much to Bookmarks for hosting this event this afternoon. And I brought a lot of stock from Bookmarks along with me, as you can see, because there's lots I'd like to refer to. I'm very sorry, a bit late starting. I was delayed on my journey here. And it's good that we're having a discussion about war, peace, causes of war, and what I want to do is emphasize some of the literary past and the way in which the power of the written and the spoken word has often been very powerful, sometimes in retrospect, against wars and the violence that goes with it. Because we're in a period when there is the war going on in Ukraine, and just to be absolutely clear, I'm totally opposed to the Russian invasion and occupation of Ukraine. It's not going to bring about peace. It's not going to bring about justice. There has to be a ceasefire. But there are many people that are sort of observing this war as armchair generals all around the world without ever thinking for a moment about what the reality of war actually is. The reality of the killing, the brutality, the bitterness that goes on forever, and in the case of Ukraine, Ukrainian civilians being killed, Russian conscripted soldiers being killed, massive resources being eaten up by this war, and millions forced to seek refuge. Before I go into the narrative I want to follow, I would also just say that I absolutely support and welcome Ukrainian refugees to this country and every other country they care to go to. And I recognize the pain and the strength of feeling they have to try and get to a place of safety. And I'm pleased at the welcome, by and large, they're getting. I would also just say the same welcome, the same principles, the same support, the same right to education, health, housing and work should apply to war refugees from Yemen, from Palestine, Syria, Libya, or anywhere else. And I hope that that is something that thank you. That is something that we can all campaign on and agree on. And I was just thinking for a moment about the power of changing opinion. In the town of Hastings, some desperate people arrive in terrible boats in order to try and get to a place of safety. I don't like people smugglers or traffickers. I don't agree with them. I think they're pretty terrible people. But I also recognize you'd have to be pretty desperate to get into some horrible little dinghy and try and cross the English Channel to get to a place of safety. It's desperation that drives people to do that. And there's a group of people in Hastings, led by Maya Evans, one of the councillors there, who's brilliant, who have set themselves up as a welcoming and support committee working alongside the RNLI, Royal National Lifeboat Institution, to make them welcome and change the whole atmosphere towards refugees arriving on our shores. It's not always easy to stand up against newspaper and media opinion, but you've got to stand up for the rights of people who are themselves largely victims of war. Many of those arriving are from Afghanistan. And so hats off to those campaigners all around the country doing stuff to support asylum seekers around the world. I want to just go back a bit, if I may, on war literature and war writings. I could go back hundreds of years, but you've told me you've got half an hour. Is that right? How strict is the half hour? It's a really strict half hour. I was doing an event the other evening with Christine Blower. She was chairing it, former General Secretary of the NUT. God, she hasn't forgotten about being a teacher. She said, "Time's up." Wonderful. Well done, her. Anyway, I want to go back to the 19th century, a time of the height of British, French, later German imperialism around the world, a time of massive levels of propaganda about the alleged advantages of the British Empire to subjected peoples all around the world, and also a time of growing military competition between the European powers, principally Britain, France, Germany, and Russia at that time. And also a time of massive growth of working class unity across the continent, coming from the struggles in this country and other countries around the time of the French Revolution and after the Napoleonic Wars, and the growth of trade unions and the growth of working class consciousness. The similar kinds of movements were happening in most industrial countries in Europe. And the trade unions, which were growing, changing from guild unions into general unions and becoming actually quite a powerful force, particularly after 1848. And those trade unions became the basis of a whole lot of socialist debate and socialist discussion all across Europe. I'm saying this briefly because obviously there's a huge history lesson to be learnt from this. But those people who were leaders of the socialist parties at that time, and many of the trade unions, were passionately opposed to war, partly because they had seen the effects on their members, their supporters, their working class communities of colonial wars. Remember, soldiers were shipped off in their tens of thousands to fight in Africa, in Asia, in parts of South America, and so on, and died as a result of it. And so it was the power of the unity of working class communities that was so important at that time. And in particular, in the latter part of the 19th century, the unity that developed and the key leading figures in this leading up to the First World War was Keir Hardie from Britain, was Karl Liebknecht, was Juarez from France, and Rosa Luxemburg, and many, many others. And they had that sense of unity about opposing the First World War, which was obviously on its way. Now, there's an awful lot written about the First World War and opposition to it, and I've got a book here somewhere I wish to quote, and when I get to the bottom of this pile I'll find it and I'll be able to quote it to you, but you'll have to bear with me while I get there. When the war itself finally broke out in 1914, there was this belief, probably naive belief, but a belief that the socialist movement and the strength of anti-war feeling in the protagonist countries would hold out and would stop the war, in Germany and France and Britain in particular. To a lesser extent in Russia, because Russia was in a different situation, but particularly those. They felt it would work. Even on the eve of the declaration of the First World War, Keir Hardie spoke in Trafalgar Square to a massive rally in opposition to the First World War. Then war finally broke out, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Hardie then went into Parliament to speak. Remember, he was a very leading figure in the Labour Party, first Labour MP and so on, and was basically prevented from completing his speech by a number of right-wing Labour MPs singing the national anthem to close him down. I've got some sympathy with his position. I thought his contribution will absolutely go down in history in all this. Now, there's a book I've got here. I probably bought it at Bookmarks, actually, because it's the kind of thing you get there, called Not Our War, Writings Against the First World War. Now, I'm tempted to quote lots of it, but you'll get annoyed at me if I do that. I recommend this book, actually, because it's very easily accessible and very readable. It goes through a timeline of the First World War, the descent into war, and how there was opposition to it, the crises of 11 and 12 Agadir and so on, and then finally the war itself, but after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, and the descent into war. Now, if anyone's looking at the current period, I do advise you to think very, very carefully about what went on in 1914. Apparently not huge event of one person being killed in Sarajevo, obviously bad, but one person being killed in Sarajevo, within a very short time descended into a all-out war in which millions and millions died, and it was the first industrial war that took place. And the story of protest against the war is absolutely amazing, and I do recommend Adam Hochschild's book, To End All Wars, a story of protest and patriotism in the First World War. Because what Adam does in that book is describes the strength of feeling against the war and those very brave people that were conscientious objectors against the war. Now, I was, not by my family, but by education, was sort of brought up with the idea that conscientious objectors were people who kind of abdicated the scene and ran away, basically sort of white feather, white flag, and all that kind of thing. They were actually incredibly brave people, because they stood up against the tide of public opinion, often in a very isolated place, and were went through incredible personal hardship. And the other evening I was giving a lecture in memory of the late great Fenner Brockway, born in 1888, died in 1987, or early 1988, just before he was 100. And he was somebody who was editor of the Labour Leader, was a prominent figure on the left, and set up the Anti-Conscription League, and as soon as the war broke out, which became absolutely huge, was very opposed, was accused of sedition and won that case, and was then accused a second time, and was imprisoned in Walton Jail in Liverpool. And he was put in solitary confinement because they recognised he was a smart, articulate person who would certainly start influencing lots of other prisoners. The last thing they wanted was Fenner Brockway talking to other prisoners about the evils of the war. They weren't all conscientious objectors. Some were, but not all of them. And so he devised an absolutely brilliant way of communicating, despite being in solitary confinement. He listened intently to any conversations that he overheard through the door and so on of prison guards and prison officers, and anything he heard. And every time he was allowed to go to the toilet, he added a few lines to a prison newspaper written on toilet paper, hidden behind the cistern in the toilet. Somehow or other prisoners got to know about this. So each time anyone went into the toilet, and if they'd heard anything of any significance, they wrote it down on this piece of paper. So that way, they gradually developed a whole narrative of what was happening in the First World War. He was then this was later found out, of course, and destroyed, and he was, I think, given hard labour as a result of it. All of those people made the most amazing sacrifices in order to oppose war. Sylvia Pankhurst, who was active in this very area, was imprisoned 24 times in HMP Holloway for suffragette activities, and her last imprisonment in Holloway was for sedition, in which it was claimed when she spoke against the First World War to a group of soldiers in Nottingham, she was urging them to mutiny against their officers. She denied that, and she described her speech and so on and so on, but she was imprisoned there. And she was one, I think, that we should always remember as Sylvia Pankhurst, as the suffragette who organised the working class women of the East End of London, who organised against the First World War. And also, she had a long and very bizarre life. She went to the Comintern in 1920 in Moscow when everybody was there in veneration of Vladimir Lenin, and she didn't agree with Lenin on something, so she started an argument with him, and the whole place goes, "Oh, hang on, who is she? She's argued against Lenin. Lenin can do no wrong." As far as she was concerned, he was completely wrong about aspects of British politics. And she said something like to him, like, "You don't know what this bunch of bureaucrats are really like, and they're trying to do me in. You shouldn't be doing deals with them." And Lenin said, "You're completely wrong, comrade." And I mean, I just wish somebody would make a film of it, because it could be very funny as well as very dramatic. And so I say that because I think we have to try and get an idea of the situation at that time. Emily Hobhouse was somebody who opposed the First World War. And it's quite interesting that the decision to actually go to war was made, yes, by the British cabinet, allegedly because of the violation of Belgian neutrality by Germany. And there used to be a penciled note that Churchill apparently wrote in the cabinet in 1914 to somebody else saying, "Would you support war even if Belgian neutrality is not broken?" He said, yeah, he would. That was Churchill. Well, he was quite keen on wars, actually. Emily Hobhouse was somebody who wrote to the cabinet in 1914 on the eve of war, in which she said that, I'm trying to find the exact words here, "Few English people have seen war in the nakedness," she wrote in the Manchester Guardian, backing the newspaper's plea for British neutrality. She wrote that as somebody who was a sort of concerned citizen. And again, what Adam's book does is goes through an analysis, yes, of the political opponents of the war, but also those that maybe hadn't thought about it all so much before, but suddenly became aware of the reality of what we were going into. And I was thinking, back in 2003, when we had that massive demonstration against the Iraq War, 1 million people in Hyde Park, I was there, obviously, and I was on the stage and looking out at this massive audience as far as the eye could see of people. They weren't all of the left. They weren't all necessarily totally politically conscious, but they were all terrified and frightened of the idea of going to war and what the implications of it could be. And so speaking out, I didn't fully understand that, but I assume it was helpful, thank you. That it is important to give that voice to speak out against it. And I think I'd also recommend that people look at the history of the Stop the War movement. The book which I have here somewhere, yes, The Graphic History of Stop the War, forward by Tony Benn, contributed by lots of people in the Stop the War Coalition, Tony Benn, many others. And it just describes, and I know it's now 19 years ago, that we mobilized so many people against the Iraq War. No, we didn't succeed. I know that. I know the Iraq War went ahead. I know British participation went ahead. But we gave that message out that there was huge popular opinion in this country against the war. That gave a fillip to many people around the world, and it's remembered forevermore and will be there forevermore should there try to be another war brought about. And I think that is something that we have to work on and recognize. There are large numbers of people that wrote amazing poetry during the First World War. And that poetry, in some ways, is the strongest poetry that I've ever read of people against the war. One of them was a young Jewish poet who lived just down the road from here, Isaac Rosenberg, who lived in Whitechapel. He was very poor. He loved poetry. He loved going to the Whitechapel Art Gallery. And he joined up because his mum was so poor, he figured the chances of getting killed were pretty low, and he'd be all right, and he'd be able to send some money home to his mum, so she wouldn't be living in desperate poverty. She lived in a tenement block just off the Mile End Road, just down here. Well, Isaac wrote the most amazing poetry about the face of death in the war, about the reality of the trenches, about the reality of what the soldiers went through, and was, of course, killed in the First World War. I recommend reading his works, Isaac Rosenberg. And his life was short and brilliant, like many, many other First World War writers, artists, and poets. Just think for a moment, had he not died then as a young man, and so many others, what they would have achieved in their lives, the poetry they would have written, the art they would have produced, the ideas they would have made. To me, war is just not right as a solution to any political issue, but it's also such a criminal waste of human life and human endeavor. And so there is so much to try and understand about those people. But 1914 was, in my view, a very fundamental point in the history of the labour movement in this country. Because the debate against the war, led by Keir Hardie, and interestingly, in that, he was supported by Ramsay MacDonald, who was also opposed to the First World War. He committed later crimes, which I don't absolve him of, but he did oppose the First World War, albeit he and Keir Hardie didn't get along terribly well on many other questions. Others, either immediately or shortly afterwards, decided to join in the wartime coalition and decided to join in supporting all aspects of the war. So I mentioned Sylvia Pankhurst. Emmeline and Christabel joined the First World War on absolutely the other side and became recruiting sergeants for the British Army. Some of the leading figures in the Labour Party later joined a wartime coalition. And so there was that fundamental parting of the ways between those that wanted to see an international working class unity against war and those that decided to go into the nationalism of the war. All of those great figures that I've mentioned died prematurely. Keir Hardie of a heart attack in 2015, when essentially his spirit was, I believe, broken because he went to his constituency, to Merthyr Tydfil, and got shouted down for opposing the First World War by the miners who had previously been very supportive of him. He found it very hard personally to cope with that, and I can understand that. Juarez was killed, Liebig was killed, Rosenberg was killed, Rosa Luxemburg, sorry, was killed, and so many others. And so we then move into the period of the 1920s when the whole Cold War mentality against the Russian Revolution had developed. And remember, British and American troops were sent into Russia after the war to try and defeat the Russian Revolution on the side of the aristocracy, the white forces. And to some extent, they were supported within the labour movement in Britain. But there's interesting times here. The dockers down the road here on the East End refused to load weapons that were being sent to oppose the Russian Revolution at a crucial point down there. And so that sense of working class consciousness and unity is often there. But I think that was a fundamental turning point when the Cold War took over and has been something that's dominated our lives and our politics ever since. And so I just want you to sort of think very carefully, particularly about that First World War period, the 1920s, and the way in which the rise of the Nazis and the use of racism to aid the growth of the Nazis, the use of anti-Semitism to aid the growth of the Nazis, infected the German labour movement and to a much lesser extent the British labour movement. Now think about this, the German labour movement was the strongest labour movement in the world. The highest level of union membership, the best level of organisation, massive level of consciousness and all the rest of it. And it was systematically and quite briefly almost totally destroyed by the rise of the Nazis, the use of nationalism, the use of anti-Semitism, the use of racism, pogroms against the Jewish people, Kristallnacht, and ultimately the Holocaust and all that went with it. There were people, very brave people in Germany that opposed the rise of the Nazis. Some went into exile, some went underground, many were killed in the concentration camps alongside Jewish people, travellers, gay people, and so on. In Britain, there was obviously opposition to the fascists, the rise of fascists, and there was the famous Battle of Cable Street, very near here, and the battle in the East End, which was then probably the largest Jewish community in Britain, where the rise of the fascists, led by Mosley, was defeated by working class unity. And so you've got to remember, and the reason I say this is, you've always got to go out there and fight against racism in any and every form at every opportunity. There can never be any place for it in our lives at all. And so I say that because we then got to look at the later post-war period and the wars that went on after 1945. And the colonial wars that went on were unbelievable in the sense they even went on at all. I'll give you a couple of, or three examples. One, 1945, end of the Second World War, Germany has been defeated and surrendered. Japan, by August 1945, has been defeated and surrendered. British forces are in very large numbers in India and in Malaya and so on, expecting and waiting to come home, as they were told they would do. And then they suddenly found they were being sent to places that they'd never been to before. A whole contingent of British troops were flown to Vietnam. Why? This was meant to be a war to end occupation and oppression. Well, that may well have applied in Europe, in the case of the occupation of Denmark, of France, of the Netherlands, Belgium, and so on. It certainly did not apply to the European colonies in the Far East. And so British forces were sent to Vietnam in order to fight the Viet Minh, who were trying to declare an independent Indochina from France. And there was a French general, General Leclerc, who was sent there to work alongside the British. And the British killed a very large number of Vietnamese fighters from the Viet Minh until the French managed to send their troops over to take over the fighting of the Viet Minh from the British, and the British then withdrew at that point, and the French were finally defeated 8 years later at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The British weren't done then. They then headed off to Indonesia. Indonesia was then a Dutch colony, and there's various notes exchanged between the forces on the ground at the time and the British cabinet about how they would have difficulty occupying the whole of Indonesia because they didn't have enough troops. And London cabled back saying, we haven't got enough because they're tied up in so many other places. We've got problems with the independence of India coming up and so on and so on. And we can't send any more. And so what did the generals on the ground do? Decided that they recognized the Indonesian fighters were using captured Japanese weapons to fight against the British. So the British released the Japanese prisoners of war, the soldiers, armed them with British weapons, put them under British command, and told them to fight the Indonesians who were fighting for their own independence from the Dutch occupation of Indonesia. So they had sort of no shame in this whatsoever. And indeed, one of the Japanese officers that was commanding his platoon or something in this war was recommended for a service medal and an honour that would be given by the British royal family if he came to London to receive it. I mean, you think this is completely crazy, but it actually happened because they were more interested in defending the idea of a French colony in Vietnam and a Dutch colony in Indonesia than they were in bringing the troops home at that time. It was a colonial mentality that was dominant at that time. Likewise, what happened in Malaya. But the one I want to refer to particularly is, thank you. I don't know what that means, but I think it means stop. Just finish on this because it's, I think, appropriate to what we're thinking about. In the 1950s, there was a uprising in Kenya against the British presence there. And so remember, this is 10, 12 years or so after the end of the Second World War. And Kenya was a place that was occupied by the British. It was a land issue, and there was a fight for independence. But there was a mentality in the attitude of the treatment of the Mau Mau fighters by the British armed services at that time. And at that point, a very small number of MPs, Fenner Brockway, Tony Benn, and one or two others, raised the issue of the abuse of Mau Mau fighters in Kenya by the British armed forces and formed the Movement for Colonial Freedom to take it up, which later became Liberation. But if I give you a quote from the treatment of historians' recollection of the treatment of Mau Mau people, I'll just read this part to you. Robert Edgerton, who was an historian, I'll read it, it's fairly long, but I think you'll realise how important it is. And this is to describe the British interrogation methods against Mau Mau people who had been captured. If a question was not answered to the interrogator's satisfaction, the subject was beaten and kicked. If that did not lead to the desired confession, and it rarely did, more force was applied. Electric shocks were widely used, and so was fire. Women were choked and held under water. Gun barrels, beer bottles, and even knives were thrust into their vaginas. Men had beer bottles thrust up their rectum, were dragged behind Land Rovers, whipped, burned, and bayoneted. Some police officers did not bother with more time-consuming forms of torture and simply shot any subject who refused to answer, then told the next subject, who had been forced to watch this cold-blooded execution, to dig his own grave. When the grave was finished, the man was asked if he would now be willing to talk. That was 1954, 55, 10 years after the end of the Second World War. Frankly, Nazi methods being used against people who were campaigning for their own right to be an independent country. And I remember the newspaper reports at the time, I was a small child, ludicrous and lurid pictures of Mau Mau fighters saying they are our enemy. No discussion about why they were fighting, why they wanted their independence, what freedom was about. That war, like Vietnam, like Indonesia, could have been avoided if we'd simply recognized the right of people to their own self-determination, which is what the Second World War was supposed to have been about. And I will just finish now because I'm being urged to end. There are many people who have written brilliant stuff about the Gulf War in 1991, about the Iran-Iraq War, and particularly about the Iraq War. I think one of the writings historically that's very interesting, and will be very interesting for future historians, was the way in which David Swanson wrote about so much of what was going on in the United States and the opposition to it, and the way in which the media were used to build up to the Iraq War, knowing full well the issues of weapons of mass destruction was a lie. And so I could go on all day, and I won't because I'm being told to stop. What I want to simply say is this. Think very, very carefully about the causes of war, the brutality of war, the costs of war, and the waste of human resources, economic resources, and the damage to all of our futures and the bitterness that comes from it. And so our children should be brought up not extolling war, but seeing war for the tragedy that it is, and the need to develop a politics and a living which is for peace, not war, a politics and a living which is for hope, not despair, and a politics and a living which is opposed to racism in any form, and an understanding of history that the whole globe gives us the common knowledge that we all share. It's not all from Europe, it's not all from the USA, it's not all from China, it's not all from Mesopotamia, it's from everywhere. Bring up our children with that sense of global realization, and then we can fight all the other struggles in unity to oppose that war. Those people in 1914 that opposed the devastation that the First World War was going to bring were incredibly brave people, and I think we should salute them for all that they tried to achieve. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Jeremy. I'm going to open up the floor. There will be a roaming mic, so I'm going to ask people to indicate hands, and I'll call you. And I'm going to give you all 3 minutes. I'm going to ask people to be really, really strict on that. I will ask you to start summing up after 2. I'll top on the mic so you know you need to sum up. And I do want people to be as thoughtful as possible because we want to get as many contributions from the floor as possible. So my first, okay, we've got the comrade here, yep.
Right. You're one of the few people in society I admire for your kindness and humanity for people and the environment. You stood up for the rights of refugees, Palestinians, and had some great proposed policies in your past manifestos, which were to renationalise the railways and bring forward a Green New Deal. You were one of the reasons that got me into politics, as well as the SWP as well. Of course, the other thing I admired was your anti-war activism, like the Iraq War, which I was only a child at the time. The Ukraine war, like many people, worries me because of the nuclear threat. But I do believe it is still unlikely as long as we keep protesting and through mass resistance. The other thing as well is obviously you like gardening and all that and horticulture. I'm a gardener myself from Capel Manor College. And I think I'll finally say, because I think there's lots of people who'd like to contribute, is that I would like to get a photo with you. Because I missed the opportunity in 2019 when you came to Chinkford to support Faiza Shaheen. That's where I live, and I hope she will beat Ian Duncan Smith at the next election. So, thank you very much for coming.
So, this comrade at the front here.
Hello again, Jeremy. My question, I was, I'm mindful of how many people are here, so I'm going to try to keep it as compartmentalised as I can. I've been a bit of an emotional wreck since Bruce Kent died, because the last time I saw him, he tried to say goodbye to me properly, like forever, proper goodbye, and I sort of dismissed it. And he was one of my sort of anti-war sort of idols, really. So I'm still crying over him, and I was very, very emotional when you were reading that passage about the torture of the Mau Mau people. And I guess my question is like slightly personal insofar as I want to know how you keep your emotions in check as well as you do, because I really admire that quality. And I'm really struggling, like at the moment I'm really struggling. I'm hoping the funeral will give me some closure, but that's my question. How do you keep your emotions in check? I don't know how many people here read the interview that Jeremy gave to something called Disclosure, I think it was called. declassified. That's it. Yeah, and I read it and I just wept, and I just was, yeah. I mean, just in the interest of the fact that we never know when our time is going to come. My admiration for you is boundless. I just, something I wanted to say to you one-to-one, but, there's so many people here, so I don't know if I had a chance to do that one-to-one, so that's what I wanted to say.
Can I give it to the comrade at the back there with the black T-shirt? It's on.
Hiya, Jeremy. My name is Richard Boyd Barrett. I'm a Member of Parliament in Ireland from People Before Profit. And I just want to say that I just want to pay tribute to you, because you are somebody who stood up for working class people, who questioned the hypocrisy and the horror of imperialism and war, and they attacked you in the most disgusting way. But there are some of us who understand how principled a fighter you are for the right things in this world. And you will be vindicated. You will be vindicated. And the second thing I just want to say, you're so right to draw the analogy with the First World War. One of my great heroes, you mentioned the list of fantastic people who stood out when it was terribly difficult against the horror of the First World War. And one of my heroes is James Connolly. I notice the leader of the RMT is also inspired by him. And he stood out when the First World War broke out. And there's a little known fact about the 1916 Rising. One of the major reasons the 1916 Rising happened against British rule was because when the First World War broke out, James Connolly said, I am going to strike a blow against this horror. And he set up the Irish Neutrality League, and for him, the need for revolt against the British Empire was precisely because he could see the slaughter that was going to happen, where 14 million people were going to be slaughtered, supposedly in the name of liberating Belgium, but in reality, in pursuit of the imperial war drive to control resources and for profits. That's what the First World War is about, and they always use some justification for it, which people can identify with the unjustified invasion of Belgium, but the real agenda was an imperialist war, and the slaughter cost millions their lives. And the last point I just want to make in that regard is we are all horrified by what Putin has done in a bloody imperialist invasion in Ukraine. But we have to call out the shocking double standards. Because the same people who are promoting war and militarism as the solution to the terrible situation in Ukraine and saying they are defending the oppressed, say nothing about Saudi's brutal war, armed and financed by the United States, by Britain, by France, say nothing about the brutal apartheid state of Israel, armed by the United States, by the Western powers. This hypocrisy has to be called out. If you're against racism, if you're against war, if you're against colonization, if you're against imperialism, you have to be against all war, all racism, all colonization, all imperialism.
Thanks so much. Can I give it to the comrade here at the front? Can people who would like to come in keep their hands up so I can make sure I see you? But in the meantime, I'm going to bring in the comrade at the front here.
Thank you, and it's wonderful to have you here, Jeremy. I've had the pleasure of working with Jeremy over many years as an officer on the National Officers Group of the Stop the War Coalition here in Britain when he was chair. And it's great to hear you talk about the broad sweep. We never got a chance for that sort of thing in the committee meetings. And I think when you start with the First World War and that sense of how it defined the 20th century, my own grandpa went over the top on the first day of the Somme, where tens of thousands of young men were absolutely slaughtered within hours just to get an inch of land. But that sense of, we were told then, my grandpa and his family were told that was the war to end all wars. But we've had war after war and that imperialist conflict, and we're seeing it today, and we're closer to a nuclear conflict than we have seen for decades. And I wondered if, Jeremy, you would say a little more about the system that generates wars, that constantly generates wars, and also the priority that the ruling class give to that. There's always money for arms. Tony Benn used to joke, your old friend and friend of the anti-war movement here, that you never saw military leaders collecting money in buckets on a Saturday on the street to arm the army, because they always have money. Because Boris Johnson has just found £1 billion for more arms, and yet they haven't got money for school dinners for people who can't feed their kids. So that's my question, really. How does the fight against wars also link in with your struggle and fight for social justice and for a different sort of society?
Thanks so much. The comrade with the blue top.
Hi, I just wanted to say about, I don't think we can talk about war and the anti-war movement without talking about the monetisation and the glamorisation of the army, and how schools will, the army will go into schools under the pretext of a fun sports day to sort of brainwash the children into what a great career the army is. Recently at my teenager's school, he's 15 but he hates PE, the army came in to do like a fun sports day. Luckily, I said to him, you can stay at home because you are not getting involved with that. The army came in and it was all, oh, look at all these careers in the army, and it's all very glamorised. The children are not taught the true horrors of war or what actually being in the army entails. And I know this goes on around a lot of schools, but also they'll have like an army recruitment day. I don't know, you might go to a fair at the local park and they'll have like an army stall there, and it's all very sort of sanitised and glamorised, and I know you all know what I mean. And that's all I wanted to say there.
Can I give it?
Yeah, I wanted to echo the solidarity that everybody's been, expressing to Jeremy, and it's really brilliant to have you here. And certainly over the last few years of the pandemic, I know that we've worked together around the Stand Up to Racism, campaign to be able to try and oppose the racist offensive that we've seen. And I think it was really brilliant how Jeremy started the meeting, because obviously it's a discussion about the anti-war movement, but we know how much these issues are linked. And to talk about the question of all refugees being welcome, and that of course, it's very important that we welcome Ukraine refugees, but it's also very important that we point out, the racism that's at the heart of a lot of the narrative around this, and say that refugees are welcome from everywhere. And at the moment, we're seeing a situation where we have stopped the first flight to Rwanda. Jeremy Corbyn was down with others. Jeremy was down outside the Home Office on the protest the night before we stopped the flight. There were protests all over the country. We're going to be protesting again on the 19th of July. The PCS and Care for Cali campaign legally is back in court to challenge the lawfulness of the Rwanda policy overall. If you're in London, get down outside the Courts of Justice 1 to 2 p.m. If you're outside of London, organise a protest in your local area on Saturday the 16th. And if you're in a workplace, join the Twitter storm that the TUC and a whole bunch of unions are supporting, because we want to keep up the momentum of that campaign, because we're certainly facing a lot of attacks at the moment, but we're also getting a little bit of a whiff of what it feels like to resist and to get some victories. I'm from Kenmure Street. I was there on the day of the mass action. We've now seen, another 3 examples where we've stopped the Home Office raids. So, I think that we've got a lot to be positive about. I want to also echo the points that Richard made. He talked about James Connolly. Another hero to talk about from that era, the First World War, is John Maclean. Just before this meeting started, we had a little sing-song about, Mrs. Barber, who led the rent strikes in Glasgow when, men were sent off to war, working class men, working class women, organised inside communities, rent strikes. We could do with a bit of that now today, I think. John Maclean made the point that a bayonet, that's a weapon with a working man at either end. Betray your country, serve your class, don't sign up for war. And I think that has echoes today, because I was a school student who walked out against the Iraq War. That was an incredible movement that completely defined, the last couple of decades. It's a reflection of the politicization that's carried on from that time through the anti-austerity movement, through the strikes that we've seen. We've seen the RMT back out again. So, I guess a question to Jeremy really would be, we've got so many people here gathered. What do we think is the way that we can kind of galvanise those movements and really turn the tide on the Tories and build the momentum for that level of resistance that can change the world?
Thanks so much. So, the comrade in the orange T-shirt.
Thank you. Thank you. I can just first say that I'm so pleased I can't have another day like this one of addressing Jeremy Corbyn in person. I missed. You have been one of those politicians I've always dreamed and always looked forward and to meet one day, and address in person is one of my biggest day in life. I have two questions. One is in terms of imperialism and war around the world. We immigrant and diasporas, we have two nations, one in heart and one always the place you live physically. We both love them, but you can't actually deny the other where you come from, while in the time of the country that hosts you presently is the country that you love. But at the same time, you have your country of where you came from, the studio of people who you look up to. My name is Isaac, an expert in international politics. I write and publish on academia platform. So the question I have here is, in 1886, talking about the British war and around the world and the invasion, the British army invaded Ethiopia, Magdala Palace, killed Theodros the second, who committed suicide, but they went away with my queen's crown, which is still now in the British Museum. The crown, the robe of wedding, and the necklace, they are items of precious history and culture. My people always cry about that, and always look forward that those things can be returned. Imagine if any country, any part of the world could walk today in Buckingham Palace and take the queen's crown. How would you people feel? Today, in this era, if I'm here now, even if Russia was coming with any bomb, I would stand in front, and so that I can also defend that, so that cannot happen. But it's one of the gross injustice that my people always look, that to say that we would like our crown returned, and the robe of wedding can be returned to my people of Ethiopia. And the second one is, the other point is, recently, if you look at the young generation now in Africa, across the globe, particularly with the rise of the broke of the war in Ukraine, it has created a lot of anti-European feeling across Africa, particularly in the global south. There is an uprising movement of anti-European, anti-France, because of the economic oppression that France has put on the people of Africa for generations, that they've never had the freedom of economy. France takes 80% of the economy of the African people. So I would like to ask you, Jeremy, what can we do as myself and people like ourselves, and as a friend of Europe and as a British resident at the moment, what mechanism can we put in place to work around diplomatic, bring more political ties with Africa in terms of stopping that social anti-European movement across Africa? Thank you very much.
Thanks. Can I get the comrade here? Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Christine Buchholz. I'm from Germany. I'm a member of the executive of the Left Party there, and I'm very happy to see you here. We had some meetings on Zoom together in the anti-war movement and also in the anti-racist movement, and I'm very happy to see you here and to meet with so many people. Today, hundreds of people are demonstrating in Berlin against Putin's war, against the escalation of NATO, and against the massive package of armament the German government decided. It's 100 billion euros that are spent extra in arms. So I think it's very important that we build, it's a hard job to build an anti-war movement. You know it here, we know it in Germany as well, but it's so important to build the anti-war movement and to stand against the immense pressure we are all facing, and we know, and it's very encouraging to see you and to listen to you, Jeremy, because we are of course attacked very severely as well as Putin fans or people who are not in solidarity with people in Ukraine, which is bullshit. Of course, we defend people and their right to defend themselves, but we are standing against this logic of war and against the way our ruling classes are using this war to spread more wars and more armament. I think it's important to see that the position is contested in left parties and organizations everywhere. We had a debate in our party if we should support arms shipments to Ukraine. And we just had a decision that we are against arms shipments to Ukraine, and that we remain on a clear position against the war. And it's we had the experience of 1914 and the Social Democrats collapsing and supporting the war. And Rosa Luxemburg was desperate for so many comrades she worked together with supporting the war. I think it's very important that we fight in our organizations and parties if we work together in broader left parties to remain in the anti-war camp and to build strong international anti-war movements. Rosa Luxemburg was killed in 1919, and I think it's very important to learn from her experience and the bitter experience she made that we have to build in organization that fights war and capitalism from the very beginning, so that we can stand in situations like this in war, that we build on this and support the movements and not be isolated, like she was. And my question to you is, what can we do to develop a real international anti-war movement? I think it's important to show our internationalism. So we are the ones who are standing for international solidarity, the anti-war camp internationally. What can we do? I would like you to come back on this.
Thank you so much. Okay, we've got the comrade here.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. And I think what I would like to draw attention to is the war that is going on inside this country. War on poor people, war on working class people, war on women, war on single women, war on little children who really don't have food to eat. We really struggle. We really struggle. There is a shortage even at the food banks. And that's the war that we should be fighting. And that's the war that we have to stop. Because what this Tory government is actually trying to do, where any problem arises, they're trying to show migration is the problem, which it isn't. So we want solidarity with asylum seekers and refugees. Because all the time, that's who get blamed all the time. That's the blame that's been put on them constantly. Don't forget, that's where it starts. When they tell us there isn't jobs. Look, these refugees are taking your jobs. There isn't any money. Oh, we have to fund the hotels. We have to fund the hotels. You don't need to fund the hotels. You don't need to fund anything. Let asylum seekers and refugees work. Let them earn their living. Let them get a place in society. That's the war. Mr. Corbyn, that's the war I want to fight with you and with everybody here. Thank you.
Oh, that's it. Thank you. Okay, we've got one final contribution from the floor.
I'm down from Glasgow, and I have to say, when Jeremy was talking about 19 years ago, which seems like a very long time ago, but we keep seeing the same pictures being repeated again and again. And when you talk about the United Kingdom, it's one of the most unequal countries in the Western world, and many people feel they have no future. Many of our young people feel they have no future. And across Europe, we see thousands of refugees who are trapped today as politicians play with their lives. We have countries that can arm countries with hundreds of millions of pounds worth of cruise missiles to save the children. Yet there are many children who are the same age as Island Kurdi, who will drown sometimes in our waters, in their rubber dinghies capsizing, and we don't know how many of them have died in recent years. And many of you will have walked past homeless people sleeping on the streets. I know in Glasgow there's a name of a young man, 28-year-old, who died last year, a Martin Bloomer, outside a shop in a city called Glasgow that likes to call itself the caring city. There can be no excuse for allowing people to sleep rough in our community while we're arming countries with hundreds of millions of weapons. We are as guilty as well of sometimes walking past young people like Martin without even a second glance. The United Nations says that 30,000 children die every day of preventable disease across the world, and in the last 10 years, 13 million children were killed worldwide by diarrhea, which costs just a few pence to treat. A few pence to treat. That's more than all the people that have died in armed conflict since the Second World War. And it's over 70 years since the end of the Second World War, when the Nazi regime in Germany embarked on the mass slaughter of Jews, of Roma people, of disabled and homosexuals, and the Nazis called them subhumans. Alongside communists and trade unionists, over 6 million people, 6 million Jews, were slaughtered in the extermination camps and the gas chambers of Auschwitz, of Birkenau, of Sobibor, of Treblinka, to name just a few. And those pictures of those emaciated corpses warns us of what happens when we look the other way. And yet once more, we see the rise of fascism across Europe. Muslims have replaced Jews as a focus of hatred, but it's a very short step to another group becoming the next target, be they Roma gypsies, be they gays, be they Jews, be they disabled people. No jobs to be had, blame the immigrants for taking them all. No houses to be had, blame the asylum seekers. These are the same dangerous ideas which led to the gas chambers. And over the years, many of us have been told, I know my parents used to tell me, there's no point in fighting. You can't fight the system. We were all, but I always used to say, and I say to my parents recently, I remember back in 93, I think it was, when the first Gulf War took place, and people said, you can't defeat them. You can't take them on. But all the things that we take for granted in this country, the right to vote, the right to be gay, the freedom of religion, the right to education, the freedom from slavery, were all once considered impossible dreams. Someone at some time decided to fight back, and whether it took them a year, it took them 10 years or hundreds of years, they won in the end. And I'll say this, when it comes to this war this time round, that you do have the armchair generals talking about engaging in a war with Russia. I'll say this, when we took on superpowers before, we have won. We won the war in Vietnam. It took meetings like this, sometimes 10 people in a room, sometimes hundreds. And then it united with the civil rights movement. It united with the anti-racist movement. It united with the LGBTI movement around the world. And we took on a superpower and we brought them to their knees. And we could do it again this time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Okay, I know there's lots of hands up. I'm going to have to apologize. No, because we're Zoom. Okay, I'm really sorry. I know there's lots more people that want to speak. I have to apologize, but we do need to wrap up this meeting. So I think it's really important that we give Jeremy an opportunity to come back with some of the questions and comments that have already been raised. So, Jeremy. And I'm going to apologize. I know there are people at the back may not be able to have a great view, but Jeremy is actually sitting because we are Zooming this live on the internet. So, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you. Look, the reason I'm sitting down is not because I want to sit down. I don't really, but apparently it's on a camera there, so it's on live stream elsewhere. So please forgive me. And I'm very sorry for all the people behind me who merely had a front row seat to the back of my head, actually. So I'm really sorry about that. And thanks for being here. Thank you all for coming, because it's incredible numbers of people. And it is an incredible event. And this kind of discussion is something that doesn't have to end today, but it is about practical discussion about mobilizing people for what we do in the future. And so there's so many things I want to say, but I'll try and be very, very brief because I'm under some pressure of time here. I should say that the last book I quoted from, The Blood Never Dried, A People's History of the British Empire, is by John Newsinger. It is in one of them that's published by Bookmarks. I've been reading it recently, just finished it, and it taught me a lot of things I didn't know before. You never really know everything, so keep on reading, keep on listening, and be very aware of algorithms on social media that drive you in the direction of the news they think you want to hear or the propaganda they think you ought to receive. So there is a whole question about media to be done. I'll try and make a brief comment about all of the 10 or 11 questions that have been asked, and they're very, very good too. But the first one was concerning very kind remarks, what you said. To me, one of the most important things we managed to achieve in the 2019 election, I know what the result was, we all know that very, very well, was an acceptance of the principle of the Green New Deal, where we don't attack people for working in polluting industries. We support them and those industries in transitioning out of them, and we develop a society that cares for all, not the few. You cannot deal with climate emergency without dealing with the system that's created the climate emergency in the first place. And through the Peace and Justice Project, we organised a week of alternative events at Webster's Theatre in Glasgow during COP26, when we brought together people, Indian farmers, Brazilian environmental campaigners, and so many others. And what was really impressive, I thought, was that all those environmental campaigners from all over the world very happily and very readily joined with the Glasgow bin workers in supporting them in their dispute and demanding better reuse, recycling and reduction of the levels of waste. And that was, to me, a seminal moment where the environmental movement and trade union movement came together practically to support each other. Rhoda, thank you so much for what you said and the way you said it. And I'm sorry if that very graphic description was horrible. It was horrible, it is horrible, but there's no reason not to say it, because it's true what actually happened there. And on Monday is the funeral of Bruce Kent, who was a very dear friend of mine over many, many years. And I think we should remember him as somebody that did so much in the 1980s particularly, but throughout his life, to raise the question of the stupidity and the danger and the horrors of nuclear war, and bring that debate firmly into everyone's living rooms. Rest in peace, Bruce Kent. You did a fantastic duty for our movement. Thank you for the, Robert, for the question you raised. And yes, my only restriction today was time. Otherwise, I would have answered the question, like, who was my favourite socialist? It's actually, well, of course, my lovely Tony Benn, but one I'd actually say is probably James Connolly, because of James Connolly's brilliance in his work and campaigning, self-taught for the most part, a bit like Keir Hardie, self-taught, no formal education beyond primary school, and in Keir Hardie's case he didn't even complete primary school, yet became brilliant in the best sense of the word intellectuals, teachers and writers. And Connolly strongly opposed the First World War, and indeed a lot of the unity that was achieved around the Easter Rising came from opposition to the First World War and the danger of conscription of Irish workers into the British Army at that time. And the point you make about the war in Yemen, our media often pass by on the other side. They have not reported day in, day out of what went on in Yemen, where British bombs fired from Saudi Arabia have reduced Yemen to a terrible situation, just as much as they're not now reporting the devastation of Afghanistan after 20 years of Western occupation. And so it is arguing about this. Now, wars don't come from nowhere, and there's huge amounts of money that are made out of war. And so I am very interested in the lobbying power and the economic power of the arms trade. I'm not blaming people that work in the arms trade. Right, okay. I'm not blaming people necessarily that work in the arms trade, because they've got to get a job. But I do say we have to look at the lobbying power, the economic power, and the investment opportunities they're given by governments all around the world. And the arms industry of itself becomes a lobbying factor on the armed services in every country. So we've just signed this AUKUS deal, Britain, United States and Australia, to build up armaments all over the South China Sea and South Asia, well, there's going to be a lot of pressure from the arms industry saying you're going to need this plane, this ship, that ship, and so on. Exactly the same pressure is going to come from those interests that are manufacturing weapons in China or Russia or elsewhere. Don't run away with the idea the arms industry is a neutral factor in this. They are part of the process, and the profits that are made out of wars are absolutely enormous. And Johnson has just announced that we're going to increase to, I believe, well over 2.5% of gross national income to go on arms expenditure, up from the 2% that's already there. Well, I just simply say this. The more and more you spend on weapons, the greater and greater the danger is they're going to be used. And there is, therefore, less money for health, for housing, for education, for all the things that we absolutely need within our society. And it means that we have to, therefore, propose serious alternatives. The questions number 6 was particularly the important one about human rights and Rwanda. And yes, I absolutely oppose the Rwanda outsourcing of asylum cases and asylum claims, and raised this issue in the Council of Europe when I spoke there 10 days ago. And also, I just ask you to bear in mind, you might not have been following the details of it because it's pretty arcane, what the British government is doing in proposing a British Bill of Rights to get around the European Court of Human Rights judgment, the interim judgment that was given to stop the flight to Rwanda, is a piece of double-dealing and lying and hypocrisy like I've seldom seen before. They're proposing a Bill of Rights, a British Bill of Rights, which say to skeptics like me, don't worry about it, we're including the European Convention on Human Rights on the face of legislation, therefore it will be in British law. They're specifically excluding access to the European Court of Human Rights, which is part of the British judicial system to get judgments one way or the other on human rights, because they're so angry that the European Court of Human Rights slapped them down on the attempt to deport one particular asylum seeker to Rwanda. These are very dangerous and very serious times. Let's support those people that are bravely standing up against that whole plan and that whole proposal. Please do. Very quickly on other points, the points that were raised from our friend about the situation in Ethiopia and Africa as a whole. What I didn't really have enough time to go into was the politics of the boundaries in Africa, or indeed for that matter the boundaries in the Middle East. All those straight lines on maps that divide peoples, languages, communities, cultures and everything else didn't come from nowhere. In the case of Africa, it was the 1884 Congress of Berlin, held obviously in Berlin, in which every European nation was represented, and the United States were there as an observer category. No African nation or people were represented at all, and they calmly, over a period of a couple of months, divided up the whole of Africa into colonies and spheres of influence. Fenner Brockway's life started with the time of the Congress of Berlin. That's when he was born. He lived long enough to see the 1945 Pan-African Unity Congress in Manchester, which paved the way for so much independence. But independence, political independence, is one thing. It doesn't necessarily end poverty or give economic independence. The powers of International Monetary Fund, of World Bank, of structural adjustment programs in the 80s and 90s have helped to damage living standards in Africa. And so I want our understanding of African history to be, yes, about the theft of the cultural icons that are residing temporarily in the British Museum and every other museum in this country. I think they'd be better off in African museums. But also it is about understanding the economics of reparations, which isn't just about the cultural icons, it is about social and trade justice with those countries as well. I want to be very, very brief in what I finish on, we have been involved in a lot of international things, and I was indeed in Berlin for a meeting organised by Jacobin magazine and many others, in which we had very large attendance, very long discussion about war issues and the need to try to bring about a ceasefire and peace in the Ukraine. The Athens Declaration, which we put together through Progressive International, is one that calls for a ceasefire, but also takes a longer-term route on the role of disarmament and less spending on weapons and so on. Because you're absolutely right. We live in the 5th richest country in the world. We have now food banks running out of food. I was talking to somebody yesterday from one of the supermarket chains who said he'd noticed that because of the rise in prices, the relative fall in wages and the growing poverty of so many people in this country, the food bank bins at the end of the line in every supermarket checkout are not filling up. And the food banks are running out of food, and the food co-ops are finding it hard to buy the food that is necessary. Yes, of course we all support food banks and all support food co-ops, but I want to see a world where people don't rely on food banks, where they're paid sufficient wages, where they are able to achieve those things. And so COVID has shown us that we're only as healthy as the person next to us. We're only as healthy as the rest of the world is. And that means there has to be that sense of internationalism in unity. And so I want to look forward. And the last thing I'll say, and it absolutely is the last thing, let's be positive for the future and not wholly negative. I'm fed up with campaigns always against closure, this, that, and the other. And so I want to see a positive way forward. And so through our project, the Project for Peace and Justice, you love the symbol, don't you? Please say yes. Thank you. We're writing a book. We're doing lots of things, lots of campaigning, supporting, and enabling other people and giving people space. We're writing a book called Why We Are Socialists. Anyone can contribute, and this is a special message to all those who think a great deal. Think no more than 499 words, because 500 words it won't go in, okay? That's the limit, because we want the book to be readable and inspirational about why people came to be socialists. We will publish it all online, and we'll publish as many as we can fit into a normal book as well. And the idea is to get that out sometime later this year as a handbook. And you can see somebody, well, why I became a socialist. It's fascinating, it's global, it's international, and above all, unites us to achieve a decent, better, fairer world. Thank you very much.